Where did you get those cheap medals? Mocking laughter rang out across the hall as every eye turned toward the young woman in simple clothes, branded as a fraud. Guests turned their backs, whispering she was nothing but a disgrace at a veterans gala. But just as the air grew suffocating, the doors burst open. Secret Service agents streamed in, and the President of the United States walked straight up to her. Then, to everyone's shock, stood at attention and saluted. "If not for you, I would not be here today." Olivia stood alone near a tall cocktail table, her hands steady, her fingers brushing the edge of her faded gray shirt. She was about 30, her face beautiful in a quiet way. No makeup, no jewelry, just clear skin and sharp, steady eyes. Her hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and her trousers were plain, slightly worn at the knees. The tarnished silver medals on her chest caught the chandelier light, glinting faintly in the Grand Washington dye. See hall around her. The gala buzzed with sharply dressed guests, military uniforms starched to perfection, suits tailored to fit dresses shimmering with sequins. Olivia didn't fit here, not to them. Her simplicity was an insult, a challenge to their world of status and shine. No one knew her name, and no one asked. They just saw her clothes, her silence, and decided she was nothing. Days before the gala, Olivia had stood in her small apartment, the invitation clutched in her hand. The paper was heavy, embossed with gold, but it felt like a weight she wasn't sure she wanted to carry. Her apartment was bare. A sagging couch, a small table with 2 chairs, a single photo frame on the wall. The photo showed her younger in uniform, standing beside a group of soldiers in the desert, their faces tired but fierce. She had touched the frame, her fingers lingering on the glass, then turned to her closet. The gray shirt was old, the trousers worn, but they were hers. She pinned the medals on her hands steady, though her breath caught when she caught her reflection in the mirror. She didn't look like a hero, she looked like herself. That was enough. Years ago, she'd been somewhere else. The desert sun burned her skin as she knelt beside a wrecked helicopter, its metal twisted and smoking. The air smelled of fuel and blood, and her hands shook as she dragged a man through the dirt, his weight heavy against her shoulder. Bullets snapped past, kicking up dust, but she kept moving, her boots slipping, her breath ragged. His eyes fluttered, his face bloody, but she didn't stop. Not when her arms burned, not when her lungs screamed. That moment lived in her now, in the way she carried herself, in the quiet strength of her hands. But here, in this glittering hall, no one saw that. They saw her clothes, her silence, and they judged. A waiter paused near Olivia, balancing a tray of champagne flutes. He was young, barely 20, his tie slightly crooked, his eyes darting nervously around the room. He glanced at her medals, then at her face, and hesitated. "Ma'am?" he said softly, offering her a glass. You look like you've seen things." His voice was quiet, almost drowned out by the crowd's chatter, but it carried a weight like he knew something the others didn't. Olivia met his gaze, her fingers pausing on the table. "I have," she said, her voice low, steady. The waiter nodded a small, respectful nod, then moved on his tray, trembling slightly. The moment was fleeting, but it cut through the noise, a tiny spark of recognition in a sea of scorn. "Hey, before we dive deeper, can you do me a quick favor? Grab your phone, hit that like button, drop a comment below, and subscribe to the channel. This story is for you. Those moments when you've been judged, overlooked, or pushed aside. Let's walk through it together. All right, let's keep going." The laughter started with a group of young officers near the bar, their uniforms crisp, their faces smug with the confidence of youth and rank. The leader, a guy with slicked back hair and a smirk that screamed entitlement, nudged his friend and pointed at Olivia. "Check out the thrift store hero," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "Bet she bought those medals online for $10. His buddies laughed, their eyes flicking to her, then away, like she wasn't worth a second glance. A woman nearby, her designer gown catching the light, leaned toward her friend and whispered, "Fake, no question. Who shows up to a veterans gala looking like that?" Her words were sharp, meant to be heard, meant to sting. A woman in a velvet dress, her hair piled high, stepped closer to Olivia, her perfume overwhelming. She tilted her head, her smile tight and mocking. Sweetie, those medals don't fool anyone, she said, her voice loud enough to draw eyes. You're embarrassing yourself standing here. The crowd around her tittered their laughter like needles. Olivia's fingers tightened on her glass, the champagne untouched, but her face stayed calm. She looked at the woman, her eyes steady, and said, I'm here for the same reason you are. The words were simple, but they landed hard, cutting through the chatter. The woman's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing, but before she could respond, the crowd's laughter swallowed the moment, their scorn rolling on. Olivia didn't flinch. She stood by her table, her fingers resting lightly on its edge, her gaze steady on the crowd. She wasn't looking for approval, wasn't searching for a way out. She was just there, her posture straight, but not stiff, like someone who knew exactly why she'd come. The whispers grew louder, the laughter sharper. A man in a tailored suit, his cufflinks flashing with tiny diamonds, chuckled and said, If she earned? At those, why is she dressed like she's here to mop the floor? His friends snorted their heads, turning to stare at her, their eyes cold and dismissive. She was a nobody, a pretender, someone who didn't belong in their world. She shifted her weight to small movement, and her fingers brushed one of her medals, not in a showy way, but like someone touching an old wound. The crowd didn't notice. They were too busy tearing her apart. A woman with a fake smile, her earrings sparkling as she tilted her head, stepped closer and said, Honey, this is for real veterans. Why don't you just leave? Her voice was syrupy, but the kind of sweet that hides venom. Olivia met her eyes, her expression unchanged, and said, I was invited. Her voice was quiet, steady, and it landed like a stone in still water. The woman blinked, caught off guard, but the crowd just laughed harder, their voices echoing off the marble walls. A young woman in a sleek black dress, her phone already out, leaned toward her date and said, Let's get a video of this. She's going to be viral for all the wrong reasons. She raised her phone, the camera flashing, and giggled as she typed a caption. Fraud alert, she muttered, her fingers flying across the screen. The crowd around her grinned, egging her on their voices, a chorus of mockery. Olivia's hand paused mid-motion, her fingers hovering over her glass, and for a split second, her lips pressed together, the only sign of strain. Then she let her hand fall, her posture unchanged, her eyes fixed on a point across the room, as if the noise was just static. The air in the hall thickened like the weight of all those stairs was pressing down on her. People weren't whispering anymore. They were pointing, shaking their heads, their voices sharp with contempt. A man with a buzz cut and a chest full of ribbons leaned toward his date and said, She's probably some con art, is trying to scam her way into free drinks. His date giggled her, manicured nails, tapping her wine glass. Another guest, a guy in his 50s with a politician's slick smile, called out, If you're such a big deal, where's your name on the wall? Why are you standing in the corner like a nobody? The room roared, the laughter bouncing off the high ceilings, and Olivia's hand tightened on the table's edge just for a second before relaxing again. A middle-aged man in a navy suit, his face flushed from too much wine, pushed through the crowd, his voice slurring slightly. Hey, you! He called out, pointing at Olivia. You think you can just waltz in here and pretend you're one of us? Those medals are an insult to everyone who actually served. His words were loud, sloppy, drawing more eyes, more laughs. The crowd parted slightly, giving him space to make a scene. Olivia's eyes flicked to him, her expression calm but piercing, and she said, I don't pretend. The words were soft, but they cut through his bluster, leaving him blinking, his mouth half open. The crowd's laughter faltered for a moment, but then surged back louder, as if to drown out her quiet defiance. An older man approached, his steps slow, his uniform slightly faded like it had seen years of wear. His face was lined, his eyes sharp, and he stopped a few feet from Olivia, squinting at her medals. That's a campaign medal, he said, his voice low but clear. Iraq 2007, frontline only. The people nearby went quiet, their smirks faltering. But then a young officer rolled his eyes and said, Yeah, right. If she's a hero, why has no one heard of her? The laughter came back louder now, and someone pulled out a phone, snapping a picture of Olivia. It was online in minutes, the caption reading, Medal Faker, caught at Veterans Gala. The crowd buzzed their scorn like a wave crashing over her. A woman in a silver gown, her hair swept into an elegant bun, sidled up to a group of officers and pointed at Olivia. "Look at her standing there like she's waiting for a medal for showing up," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "If she's such a hero, where's her entourage? Where's her spotlight?" The officers chuckled, one of them, mimicking a salute in her direction, his gesture exaggerated and mocking. The crowd ate it up, their laughter swelling, their eyes glinting with malice. Olivia's fingers twitched just slightly as she adjusted her stance, her medals catching the light. She didn't respond, didn't look at them, but her silence seemed to fuel their contempt, like she was daring them to keep going. Olivia didn't react. She didn't look at the phone, didn't acknowledge the laughter. Her fingers stayed on the table, her face unreadable, but her shoulders lifted slightly, like she was bracing for more. The old veteran watched her a moment longer, his eyes narrowing, then turned and limped away, his cane tapping the floor. The crowd didn't care. They had decided she was a fraud, a leech trying to steal their glory. The whispers turned into a hum of contempt, and the air felt like it was closing in, heavy with judgment. A memory flickered through her. She was back in a dusty barrack, sitting on a cot, her hands bandaged from burns. A soldier across from her, his face young and scared, handed her a cup of water, his voice shaking. "You saved him," he said, his eyes wide. "You saved the whole unit." Olivia had looked away, her fingers tightening on the cup, the weight of his words settling into her bones. The memory faded, and she was back in the hall, the laughter louder now, the crowd's eyes sharper. She straightened her shoulders, her gaze steady, as if that moment in the barracks was holding her up. A senior officer took the stage, his chest puffed out, his voice booming through the microphone. "Imposters shame our military," he said, his eyes locking. Onto Olivia. The crowd turned their stares like knives. "We honor real heroes here, not people who play dress-up." The room erupted in applause, some people clapping so hard their hands turned red. A businessman in a sleek suit shouted, "Prove it then, show us your papers." Laughter rolled through the crowd again, and Olivia's hand trembled as it clutched the hem of her shirt. She didn't look up, didn't speak, but the tremble was there just for a moment before her hand steadied again. A young reporter, his press badge dangling from his jacket, pushed through the crowd, his pen scribbling furiously. "This is gold," he muttered to his colleague, his eyes fixed on Olivia. "She's going to crash and burn, and we've got front row seats." He raised his voice, calling out to her, "Hey lady, got any proof you're not a fraud? Or you just here for the free food?" The crowd laughed, their voices a cruel chorus, and the reporter grinned, sensing a story. Olivia's fingers paused on her glass, her eyes flicking to him for a moment, and she said, "I don't owe you proof." Her voice was calm, but it carried, and the reporter's grin faltered, his pen slowing as the crowd's laughter drowned out his next words. She lifted her head slightly, her eyes scanning the room, not in defiance, but in quiet observation. The officer on stage kept talking, his words dripping with scorn, but she didn't flinch. A woman nearby, her hair sprayed into a perfect updo, leaned toward her friend and said, "She's got some nerve standing there like she belongs." Her friend nodded, her lips curling, probably thinks she's fooling someone. The room was a wall of noise, now laughter, whispers, accusations. Olivia's fingers brushed her medals again, a small, unconscious movement, and then she let her hand fall to her side. A man in a tuxedo, his face polished with self-importance, leaned toward his tablemates and said, "She's probably some activist trying to make a point. Those medals are just props." His voice was loud, meant to draw attention, and it did. Heads turned, eyes narrowed, and the laughter swelled again. He raised his glass, toasting his own cleverness, and the crowd joined in their glasses, clinking. Olivia's hand rested on her bag, her fingers tightening briefly on the strap, but her face stayed calm. She looked at him, her gaze steady, and said, "Props don't save lives." The words were soft, but they landed like a slap, and the man's glass froze halfway to his lips, his smirk fading. The hall doors swung open, and the room went still. Secret Service agents streamed in their faces, blank, their movements precise. They scanned the crowd, their earpieces glinting under the lights. People exchanged glances, confused, some nervous. Then the President of the United States walked in, his suit, impeccable, his stride steady. The crowd parted their whispers, fading into a stunned silence. "Why is he here?" someone muttered. Phones came out, cameras flashing, everyone expecting a spectacle. They thought they knew what was coming. They thought Olivia was about to be exposed, humiliated, dragged out in disgrace. A woman in a red dress, her earrings glinting as she leaned forward, clutched her husband's arm. "This is it," she whispered, her voice trembling with excitement. "She's going to be humiliated on national TV." Her husband nodded, his eyes gleaming. "About time," he said. A young veteran nearby, his jaw tight, growled, "She shouldn't be here another second." The crowd's eyes locked on Olivia, waiting for her to crumble. She didn't look up. Her hands stayed by her sides, her face calm, but she shifted her weight just slightly, like she was grounding herself against the storm. A security guard near the door, his uniform stiff, his face unreadable, watched the scene unfold. He'd seen Olivia earlier standing alone and had noticed the way her fingers brushed her medals like they were part of her. Now, as the crowd's whispers turned to eager murmurs, he stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. He didn't say anything, but his hand rested on his radio as if he sensed something the others didn't. Olivia caught his gaze for a moment, her expression unchanged, but she gave a small nod, almost imperceptible. The guard nodded back, his posture easing slightly, and turned away, his radio crackling softly as he moved. The president didn't hesitate. He walked straight toward Olivia, his steps deliberate, his face unreadable. The crowd held its breath, their phones still raised, their whispers silenced. They expected him to point to a cue to make an example of her. A man in a navy blazer, his face flushed with excitement, leaned toward his wife and said, "She's done for. They're going to call her out on national news." A reporter nearby, her notebook open, whispered to her colleague, "Tomorrow's headline, Fraud of the Year." The air was electric, the room waiting for her to fall. But the president stopped in front of her. He didn't speak. He didn't accuse. He stood tall, his shoulders back, and raised his hand in a crisp military salute. The hall gasped, a collective intake of breath that echoed off the walls. Olivia lifted her head, her eyes meeting his, and she returned the salute, her movement precise, but not showy. The president's voice cut through the silence. "If not for her, I would not be alive today." The words landed like a bomb, and the room exploded in murmurs and shock and disbelief. A woman in a sequin gown, her purse clutched tight, stumbled back a step, her face pale. "He's got to be mistaken," she whispered, her voice shaking. An officer nearby, his medals gleaming, sputtered, "Impossible. How could she have saved the president?" A reporter pushed forward, his voice loud. "Mr. President, what are you saying?" The crowd surged with questions, their doubt palpable, their refusal to believe like a wall. They couldn't accept it. And at her, not this woman in her plain clothes and tarnished medals. The room descended into chaos, voices overlapping, people shouting over each other. A young soldier in the back, his uniform slightly too big, his eyes wide, pushed forward, and his hands trembling. He'd been quiet all night, watching from the sidelines, but now he stared at Olivia, his breath catching. "I know her," he said, his voice barely audible over the crowd. "She was there in the crash." His words were lost in the noise, but his face was raw, his eyes wet as he looked at her. Olivia didn't see him, her gaze fixed on the president, but her hand tightened on her bag, the strap creasing under her fingers as if she felt the weight of his recognition. The president reached into his pocket and pulled out a faded photograph. He held it up, his hand steady. The image was clear. Olivia, her face streaked with mud, standing beside a burning helicopter. Her uniform was torn, her hands bloody, but her eyes were fierce-focused. The president's voice was calm but firm. "This is the soldier who dragged me from the wreck that day." The hall went silent. A few veterans in the crowd bowed their heads, their eyes wet. Others stood frozen, their faces pale. The man who'd called her a fraud earlier dropped his glass, the shatter loud in the quiet. Olivia didn't move. She didn't smile, didn't nod. She just stood there, her hands clasped in front of her, her medals catching the light. The crowd's eyes were on her now, but not with scorn. Some looked away, ashamed. Others stared, their mouths open, trying to process what they just heard. The old veteran from earlier pushed through the crowd, his limp more pronounced, and stopped in front of her. He didn't say anything. He just saluted, his hand trembling but steady enough. She returned it, her movement slow, deliberate. A woman in a pearl necklace, her face flushed with embarrassment, tried to slip toward the back of the room. Her heels clicked loudly on the marble drawing eyes, and she froze her hands, clutching her purse. "I didn't mean," she started, her voice trailing off as heads turned toward her. The crowd's silence was heavy now, not with contempt, but with judgment, and she shrank under it, her earlier confidence gone. Olivia didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge the stammered words. She just stood there, her posture unchanged, her presence filling the room in a way no one had expected. The businessman who'd mocked her earlier stammered, his voice weak. "If she's so great, why she dress like that? Why live like this?" His words sounded desperate now, like he was grasping for something to hold on to. Another guest, a woman with a diamond brooch, muttered, "A real hero wouldn't hide. She'd want the spotlight." The crowd's eyes turned back to Olivia, waiting for her to explain, to justify herself. They wanted her to prove it all over again, to grovel for their approval. She lifted her head, her gaze calm, steady. "I don't need glory," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "I only need the people alive today." The words hung in the air, simple, undeniable. The president nodded, his face solemn. "And we owe you our salute," he said. He turned to the Secret Service agents and military aides behind him, and as one, they raised their hands in a unified salute. The hall erupted, not in laughter this time, but in emotion. Gasps, sobs, murmurs of awe. Some guests sank to their knees, their heads bowed. Others stood froze in their faces, a mix of shame and wonder. A veteran in a wheelchair, his hands gnarled from years of service, rolled forward, his eyes fixed on Olivia. He stopped a few feet away, his voice rough but steady. "I was there that day," he said loud enough for the room to hear. "She didn't just save him, she saved us all." His hands trembled as he raised them in a salute, his eyes wet but proud. The crowd parted, their silence heavy with respect, and Olivia met his gaze, her lips pressing together for a moment before she returned his salute, her movement slow and deliberate. The room seemed to hold its breath, the weight of his words sinking in. The next day, the headline screamed across every news outlet. "Woman mocked for fake medals, saluted by the President of the United States." The officer who'd called her an imposter was quietly let go from his post, his name scrubbed from the gala's records. The businessman who'd laughed at her clothes lost his biggest client, the news spreading online like wildfire. The woman in the designer gown, the one who'd whispered about fakes, saw her social media flooded with comments calling out her cruelty. The young woman who posted the video was dropped by her sponsor, her fraud alert post buried under a wave of corrections. None of it was dramatic. No grand showdowns or public apologies, just consequences, quiet and real, like ripples spreading across a still pond. Olivia didn't stay to watch it unfold. She left the hall that night, her steps steady, her bag slung over her shoulder. She didn't look back, didn't pause to see the crowd's faces. Her husband met her outside his presence, quiet but unmistakable. He didn't say much, just opened the car door for her, his hand brushing hers as she climbed in. The crowd outside parted as they drove away, their faces a mix of awe and regret. No one needed to say his name, his presence was enough. She sat in the car, her medal still pinned to her shirt, her hands folded in her lap. The city lights blurred past, and for a moment she glanced at a small photo tucked in her bag. A younger version of herself standing in the desert, her face tired but unbroken. She didn't smile, didn't cry. She just closed the bag and looked out the window, the world moving past her. The people who'd mocked her would carry that night with them, a weight they couldn't shake. They'd underestimated her, judged her by her clothes, her silence, her lack of flash, but she didn't need their approval. She never had. Her life wasn't about glory or recognition. It was about the people she'd saved, the ones who were still breathing because of her. You've been there, haven't you? Judged for how you look, what you wear, who you are. You felt those eyes, heard those whispers. You weren't wrong to stand tall. You weren't alone in that moment, and you're not alone now. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.